Start again. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Parkland's National Conversation on Reconciliation. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge I'm calling from the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I do this as an act of reconciliation and out of respect for the peoples on whose land I live, work, and play, and I encourage each of you to take a moment to do the same. In 2021, Parkland started our journey with a Canadian Indigenous Relations strategy. Since then, we've been developing a program bringing resources to our staff, providing Indigenous communities opportunities for employment, capacity development, and social investment. We're working hard to engage with nations on whose territories we operate, have encouraged pathways to conversation, and will continue to champion this important work. Throughout the week of September 25th, our Indigenous Relations team is traveling coast to coast, hosting Bannock Breaks and delivering sessions on PAR and Indigenous History 101. I hope you take advantage of these opportunities to enhance your own understanding of Indigenous relations, as well as how Parkland's working to build pathways to reconciliation through targeted talent sourcing, procurement, social investment, and our own internal competency cultural training. We're delighted to be welcoming today 3 esteemed speakers to our panel discussion. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to share their thoughts, followed by a 5-minute question period. I ask that if any of you have questions, and I hope some of you do, that you please put them in the chat. That way we can get through as many as possible. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Dustin Louie. Dr. Louie is a First Nations scholar from Nitai-Bun and Notlay-Whatan of the Dekanith Nation of Central BC. I do this respectfully and hope I'm not making too many mistakes. He's also a member of the Beaver Clan. Dustin's a tenured professor at UBC and is the director of the Indigenous Teachers Education Program. He's worked extensively in the past on Indigenous education, social justice, and educational philosophy. And in fact, he's been a great support in Parkland's own educational journey. Robin Rattlesnake is a member of the Tsuut'ina-o-Watson-Bing Reserve in Manitoba. She's the Indigenous Affairs Secretariat with the Canadian Border Services Agency and is the president of the board of the Pacific Association of First Nations Women, an organization that envisions a matriarchal community where all Indigenous women are safe, respected, have a sense of belonging to cultural traditions. They advocate for systems change, provide culturally safe learning, and holistic supports to uplift Indigenous women and strengthen families and advocate on issues that impact the health and well-being of First Nations women in BC. Also joining us, Marnie Point comes from Musqueam Indian Band in BC. She's a well-respected educator and current PhD student in language and literacy at UBC. Marnie's studies and teachings focus on the connection to Indigenous language, which gives value, honor, and sense of identity, cementing Native Indigenous people in place and culture. She's an avid fisherwoman, owning and operating her own gilt netter, harvesting sockeye salmon from the Fraser River, as her dad and grandfather always did. We're going to start today with Dr. Dustin Louie.
All right, thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? All right, excellent. Thanks, everyone. I'm really thrilled to get to spend some time with you folks today talking about, the Day of Truth and Reconciliation and thinking about how we can envision it in our own practice and the work that we do and just the way we exist, as fellow people who live on this territory together. So I'm coming to you from Musqueam territory, and I think it's so important to be able to recognize that I'm a visitor in this place. I'm an uninvited visitor and incredibly appreciative of the Musqueam folks and the ways in which they've welcomed me and the ways in which they've stewarded the land and the knowledge that I've had the great opportunity to learn from them. So I really like to try to carry that into the work that I do and carry in the spirit of what it means to be a good host from the folks in this territory and try to walk lightly in these spaces and honor the folks who've come here before. So what I wanted to discuss with you folks today is helping us think more about how can we position ourselves within this day, because I think there's a lot of people, I do a lot of work with different folks in so many different areas, and there's a lot of people have this real apprehension of not knowing how they can contribute to this work, and feeling this ill at ease of like, I don't want to overstep, what's appropriate for me to take up. And for me, it sort of gets back to the idea of what it is that reconciliation means and what is it that we're reconciling for, I think are two really important questions I like to ask myself. And I think, when we talk about what reconciliation means, sometimes it can get positioned as primarily around like apologies. We've seen multiple apologies given from like governments, from churches, from different organizations of the role they've played in colonization and role they've played in the harm of Indigenous people. And I think apologies are definitely a component of reconciliation, but it's not everything. And when you hear Indigenous folks calling for reconciliation, we're not typically calling for like more apologies. We're saying there's still problems within the way we exist right now. And, I like to really rely on Marie Sinclair's idea of that reconciliation is creating a relationship of mutual respect. And that goes well beyond just simply an apology. It goes into these spaces of how do we envision the ways in which we live together? The ways in which settlers and Indigenous folks live together in these spaces. And I think one thing that we can all recognize is the history of that relationship is fraught with problematic aspects. It's fraught with a devaluation of Indigenous people. It's fraught with delegitimization of our knowledges. It's fraught with the dehumanization of Indigenous people. All these components of it are part of our history. And I think reconciliation is imagining a future that's far different than the histories in which we've existed with so far. How do we move forward in relationships where we value each other meaningfully, not just claiming to do, but living that way? How do we go forward with a future where Indigenous voices are just as pertinent and relevant and considered as any other voices? How do we go forward where Indigenous ways of knowing are present within the ways in which we exist, the ways we communicate, the ways we make decisions? And how do we go forward in the future of truly valuing one another? And to me, like when we talk about reconciliation, that's what we're trying to achieve. And that we have these events in history that are these real signifiers that hasn't been the case so far. So I think the one that most of us are familiar with is to look at residential schools. But I think the one thing we need to really be intentional about is not see residential schools as some aberration from the rest of Canadian society or something separate from the rest of Canadian society. I think the treatment of Indigenous peoples, the way in which indigeneity was viewed in there, was very much in line with the way rest of society viewed Indigenous folks. It's not something separate. It's not this one problematic system and then the rest of Canada was operating in a good way. That's not it at all. I think it's very reflective of the overall relationship that has existed, and in many ways still does exist between Indigenous and settler communities. So, instead of only thinking of it primarily as an apology, we need to think of what elements are still there that are causing issues in this relationship? In what ways are we still devaluing indigeneity? In what ways are we still delegitimizing Indigenous ways of knowing? And I think, it's so critical for us to think not only like within our own lives of like the communities that we live in, the places in which we grew up, but also thinking about the area that we now work in. What histories does our sector specifically have to reconcile for? What harms have been caused both in the past and the present in the sector we specifically work in? And when we think about reconciliation, it's how are we disrupting those things that we have influence over now? Are we ensuring that we're creating healthy work environments for all sorts of people to come work within? Or is that a space that's not welcome for other people? If we think of the communities in which we're working in, are we meaningfully connected to the nations and the people who are from those territories as well? Those are acts of reconciliation that we can do. So I think while our introductory examples are typically around residential schools, we need to expand that to the ways in which, what's getting in the way of the space of mutual respect. And I think there's so many ways in which we can sort of engage with that, regardless of whatever your role is within the organization. I think you have a huge role to play into how you connect with the community, how you create this environment within your own workspace. And the next question that I often see from people is, say many of you are probably non-Indigenous, of saying like, what role can I play as a non-Indigenous person is what people are asking themselves, and really unsure about overstepping. And if we think, the aim of this work is to change that relationship, then everybody has a responsibility into helping create that relationship of mutual respect. And I think of like, oftentimes when I work with folks, and when I worked with Parkland before, we've done this exercise where at the beginning of each session we talk about what are some acts of reconciliation that we've witnessed since the last time we've come together, because I want people recognizing like these seemingly small acts can build together to create these larger movements. And I think it can be easy for us to not see the significance in these smaller moments, but I think like for those of us living in these communities and, you know, participating in these systems, these small acts can sort of build up to be really significant things. So a couple of the examples that I like to share of like acts of reconciliation that I've witnessed on, you know, the Day of Truth and Reconciliation over the last couple of years, you know, talking with staff of different organizations and hearing their experiences, there's a couple that really, you know, jump out to me of like these moments that could be seen as seemingly small, but I think, you know, grow to make a bigger difference. One of them was 2 years ago, one of the staff of the Friendship Center was telling me that her partner worked in a garage, and coming up to September 30th, a number of people in the garage were saying very dismissive things about, you know, the Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and like very uninformed perspectives on the whole day or residential schooling or any of those things. And on that day, her husband just wore an orange shirt into work that day. And I think like, while that can be seen as like, well, that's one day and this person wore a shirt, I think that's really challenging that space. You know, up until then, that space was very comfortable being vocally critical of this movement. And yet her husband walked in just wearing a shirt that day saying like, you know, I support this movement and I recognize these things that have occurred. And I don't think that the next day everybody in the garage like, yeah, got it and was fully on board, but it's contesting that space and saying, you know, I see things differently, had a couple of small conversations with people. And from my perspective, that's the beginning of how change happens. You know, there's not, we could say the most brilliant thing possible, and there's probably very unlikely to be somebody who on the spot changes their mind about something. But if you get continued exposures to these other ways of seeing things or these other perspectives, that's how we begin to shift our thinking. And if we think of, you know, there's plenty of things now that we see differently than we did 10 years ago. And we think of like, what are those continued exposures and how did that make a bit of a difference? So each of us has the power to do that. How do we contest spaces that have historically, you know, not been welcoming to these ideas, not been welcoming to Indigenous people, not been welcoming to communities? And how do we participate in making that more of a welcoming space? And I think each of us has the possibility to do that, both within our work at the organization and within the communities that we live in as well. We have the potential to do that. Another example that I like to share is, I think it was 3 years ago, I was at Cranbrook for on the 29th and 30th. And if for people who've been to Cranbrook, they have their residential school has been transformed into like a hotel, golf course, casino, and they've kind of reimagined what that space is like, which I think for each community is up to them to decide what they want to do with those spaces. And this is what they've decided to do. And I spent the night in there the night before, and they had a dinner, and they had a dinner in what used to be the chapel in the school. And before we started, some of the leaders of their community the Ktunaxa community got up and they were speaking in Ktunaxa before the dinner. And I was sitting at the table with some of the survivors, and they said to me, you know, going to school here, I could never have imagined anyone speaking Ktunaxa in this room. They're like, never mind this school, nobody would really do that there because of like the significant consequences. But they said this room in particular is somewhere where I could never imagine Ktunaxa being spoken in. And to get to this place where we now feel comfortable speaking our languages no matter where we are, we're no longer facing that like violent retribution for speaking it. While seemingly small, I could see the big difference, like how much it impacted the peoples who had been in that institution and now witnessing that taking back control of those spaces again. And I think, how are we providing those opportunities in other spaces that we work within for people to be who they are, to bring their culture into their work with them? When we're, you know, working together with community members, are we asking them to work together based on the way we do things, or are we willing to do things, you know, aligned with the way they do things? Maybe their style of meetings would be drastically different. Maybe their expectations for like getting to know each other would be quite a bit different to work together. I think there's so many different ways in which we can envision this, and I think there's so many ways in which we could take this on as well. You know, and I think like another big one, and when I was working together with some of your senior leadership team, you know, the thing that I sort of saw that was pretty consistent is many people spoke to these moments of reconciliation. They talked about how their kids know so much more than they do, saying that like the younger generations in school come home and sort of teach the parents about what they've learned about, you know, histories of colonization and Indigenous knowledges and all these different things. And, you know, I think that's such a huge sign for us and such a positive direction we're moving in as a country, where the younger people, you know, are getting these teachings from the, you know, the time they're like 6, 7, 8. I tell people a lot of times that you know, a lot of, 9 and 10-year-olds who are going through school now know more about the history of colonization than I did when I finished my undergrad. And I did my undergrad in Canadian history, so you think that'd be something that I get exposed to, but just no real opportunities for that. So I think that, that's a huge sign. And how are we, empowering those younger voices to sort of educate some of the older folks? In that meeting as well, one of the people shared that there was like this huge generational difference in understanding between someone's parents and then the grandkids. And there was kind of like disagreement over, what was real history. And I think like those conversations are incredibly important, where we give that space for the young people to be able to teach some of us and some of the older generation about the things they've learned. So, the thing that I really want to emphasize is that every single one of us has a role to play in reconciliation. If what we're going to do is, get to the space that Murray Sinclair talks about, which is the space of mutual respect, it's going to require every single one of us to participate, to bring together communities, to challenge this, contest the spaces that we're working in, contest the communities that we're living in, because we're recognizing, this day recognizes we have a real problematic history in this country. And we can point to, these different moments of like residential schools, the 60s scoop, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There's all these moments we can point to, but I think that tells us the general trend or the general history of the country we live in, that has been based on this deep valuation and this sort of relationship that lacks respect. And what are we doing to contribute to moving back in that space of those spaces of mutual respect? And what can we do individually? And I think that's always, the way we think about it, and not putting the pressure on ourselves of like, well, I'm going to end racism in your division. That's a generational project that we're going to be working on, but recognizing these small successes and then pushing forward. I think in many places, as we've witnessed here, we've seen, these acts of reconciliation, which are, the land acknowledgement. And sometimes I see criticisms of land acknowledgement. And I understand the criticism if we see that as the final step. But if we see it as the introductory step, then I think it's really exciting, because we're normalizing, recognizing the stewardship that Indigenous people have done in these places for so long. We're recognizing the colonial histories of these places. We're recognizing how important knowledges are. We're recognizing, that we're visitors in these places. And how do we embody those same teachings or those same ideas outside of just that moment that we name at the beginning of the acknowledgement? And I think it's more of a prompt, or it's more of a reminder of like, how do we live this way beyond just this moment that we've named it here? And I think that's the way we can live these acts of reconciliation. So I understand, some of you folks out there are feeling apprehensive, but this is me like welcoming you to the movement, encouraging you to participate in the movement, and seeing that, every single one of us has a role to play. And I think, there's cause for optimism, because we're seeing some really beautiful things happening. So thanks so much for letting me get to share with you folks a little bit today. Look forward to some of the questions. Just thank you again.
Thank you very much. I'm just gonna make one comment before we move to the questions. I think it really resonated with me, your point about small incremental steps make a difference. I think a lot of people worry, what can I do? Is it enough? So I really appreciate your insight on all that. I think it'll be very helpful to everyone here. And maybe I'll riff off that on one of the questions that we have here is, I'm new to reconciliation, so where do I start?
Yeah, great question. I think there's that fear for so many different people. I think like one of the things you can do is like learn about the people and place in which you live right now. I think that's such a huge thing. In one of the districts I do work with in the north, one of the courses that we created was helping students connect to their own identity, and then connecting that to the people and place in which they live right now. Understanding, who are the people who were on this territory before us? How can I learn more about them? How can I like become connected to those communities? And learn like how can I live, in good relations with the people who are here. I think that's such a really great place to start. I think like, I know Jody has provided like lots of opportunities with teachings, like just attending the events that are available to you within the organization can help you learn so much more about like decolonization, can help you learn so much more about what the organization is beginning to do. And just like being comfortable, being uncomfortable for the first little bit, and being open to the fact that, some of the things you're going to learn are going to be discomforting, because we're going to shift our view somewhat about the history of the place in which we live right now. We're going to shift our view of something about the relationship. So I think there's so much great work happening, both like with Jody and her team in the organization and just like around. And I think just like being open to attending some of those events and open to shifting your thinking is such a good way of starting it.
Thank you. I'll merge two questions together here. The first one is, someone said they started Highway of Tears and asking what other books you suggest they can read to learn more. And related to that is just a request of where's a good place to get resources.
Yeah, so I think there's so many different good books out there that you can take a look at. Like I think of more in terms of papers, but there's a really good book, and I think like the first half especially gives you a really great introduction into these issues. It's called The Colonial Problem by Lisa Monchalin. So she's a scholar who's, I think, Korean Mohawk, but teaches at Kwantlen, I believe. And her book is like a really great introduction in the first half, especially to like the histories of colonization and how these things had happened. I think that's a really excellent read. You know, you could read folks like Maria Batiste has a few books out there, but those are sort of more in the academic space that you would look at. You know, the thing that I always recommend people read, which I think is so fascinating, and I just taught it to my undergrads recently, is there's an article out there called Jagged Worldviews Colliding by Leroy Littlebear, and you can find it online, all these different places. And I think that's such a beautiful article that talks about just like the difference in the worldviews of traditional indigenous worldviews versus like traditional Western scientific views. And I think it gives us some insight into the experiences of indigenous people, and like getting into these more like nuanced or different areas of understanding the differences between cultures. I think that's really helpful. But yeah, I think Lisa Monchalin's book is a really great one to start with. I think it's quite accessible. It's primarily about like indigenous folks in the legal system, but the first half just gives like a general overview of some indigenous histories, which I think could be very helpful for people to take a look at.
I might just put a plug in there too. Our Indigenous Relations team has an Indigenous Lending Library and a book club. So if anyone wants to learn more about those, feel free to reach out to Jody Simpkin or Fiona Hood. Do I've got time for one more question with Dustin before we move on? I'm just going to say yes. I think this is an important one as well. You know, the question of how will I be sure I'm not doing anything wrong in my attempts at reconciliation?
You're not going to be sure, and that's the fraught space that we go into. You know, even those of us like working in this field like can get things wrong, and I think it's like, how do you approach this work and how do you develop relationships beforehand so that when you do get things incorrect, people understand where you're coming from. You know, I think about like I was working in a Cree community in the north, and we were, you know, doing this work with teachers, and one of the things we were asking them to do was to do a check-in before they started. And over again, we were asking the teachers, like, when the students were coming in, to say like, how are you doing, and checking in on the students. And people came to us like after they weren't doing it for 2 weeks and were getting really frustrated, and they said to us, in our community, it's inappropriate to ask someone how they're doing because it puts someone in a position to either tell you something they don't want to or lie to you. So it's inappropriate to ask that question. So us as like experts in this area can go into community and make those mistakes. But since we developed those really good relationships and let them know where we were coming from, position ourselves as learners, they would just tease us. Like when we'd walk down the hallway, they would like in very excited ways ask how we were doing, just to like tease us when we were in the school. So like we can't know everything. You know, there's mistakes that we're going to make along the way because we're going to exist within different cultures where things are done differently. We can't know the way everything's being done. But I think if we focus on relationship building at the beginning, then when we do make those mistakes, it's understood because, you know, they know where we're coming from, they know who we are as people, and that can, you know, relieve some of that stress of like having to go in there and be perfect and get everything right. So for me, that's why relationship building is so important before you get to the work, no matter, you know, what area you're working in. And I think that relationship, you know, puts us in a far stronger position when we inevitably do make some of those mistakes, that they're understood differently.
Great, thank you so much for your insight. Next up is going to be Robin, and I know we didn't get to every question, but if we have some time at the end, we'll try and circle back to a few. Thanks, Robin.
Okay, so do I push share? Or is it there? Push share? Okay. First, I want to say hi, everyone. Thank you, Dustin. That was very good. And I'm really glad to be here with you. And thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Okay. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the Pacific Association of First Nation Women. This is a nonprofit organization in the downtown east side of Vancouver. The Pacific Association of First Nation Women was founded in 1981 in downtown Vancouver by two really amazing women, Angie Todd Dennis and Marge White. They had they're pioneering community builders who had a goal of bridging the gap between Indigenous communities and people and public institutions. They actually have done a lot of really good work, and they have had a hand in or founded other wonderful nonprofits that we see today that are still there, and including the Friendship Centers circuit that is there. That's one of the most common known nonprofits. So of course, Angie doesn't look like this lovely young photo of her now. She's actually 80. So the original name of the organization was the West Coastal Women's Association. So our organization really wants to take a multi-pronged approach to addressing the marginalization of Indigenous women while promoting capacity building. And everything we do, we have a strong cultural practice around it. We try to do everything in an Indigenous manner. So to bring our vision into reality, we offer holistic supports to uplift Indigenous women and strengthen families. And we provide ongoing programs to connect urbanized Indigenous women and families with cultural practices, Indigenous knowledge, and tools to address barriers. So here in this picture, we see Elder Fishwoman. She has the 7 sacred teachings up. So I do want to talk to you about some barriers. I actually had a little bit of difficulty with this, and I scaled back quite a bit when I was thinking about what I was going to talk to you about, but I will go forward. So I just wanted to say that if anything that I talk about today in this portion is upsetting to you, or you need to reach out, I can just ask that you reach out to the organizers of this event, and hopefully they have some resources available to you. So I apologize if any of this is upsetting at this time. So Indigenous women in Canada continue to be impacted by historical and ongoing colonialism. Colonial policies such as the